The rain had not stopped for 37 days. Father Cassius Thorne pressed his palm against the wooden planks of the trench wall, feeling the rot seep through the blessed timber. Each droplet that struck his shoulders carried the weight of 1,000 screaming souls, or so whispered the soldiers who still possessed enough faith to whisper at all. The mud beneath his boots squelched with a sound too wet, too eager, as if the earth itself had developed an appetite for the living. The new syncretic Orthodox had established their forward chaplaincy in what had once been the shrine of the martyrs, before the Hebrew Knights' relic engines had reduced it to blessed rubble and corpse stone. Now it served as a confessional bunker, its stained glass windows replaced with iron plates punctured by rifle ports. The altar, where saints had once received their final communion, now held bolt-action rifles, their wooden stocks carved with prayers that grew fainter with each passing day. Thorne had arrived 3 weeks prior, carrying letters of appointment from the Sacred Synod and a stomach full of certainty about the righteousness of their cause. The certainty had curdled within hours of his arrival. The soldiers who knelt before him for confession spoke not of battlefield horrors or homesickness, but of dreams where their own bones rearranged themselves into geometric patterns they could not name. They spoke of waking to find their fingernails grown long and black, of tasting copper pennies when they swallowed their morning prayers. The chaplain before him, Father Mordecai, had vanished without explanation. His personal effects remained untouched in the small chamber behind the altar, a leather-bound breviary whose pages had begun to bleed actual blood when opened, a collection of pressed flowers that still screamed when touched, and a rosary whose beads had fused together into a single, writhing mass. The commanding officer, Major Corinth, had explained Mordecai's absence with a shrug and a knowing look that suggested questions would not be welcomed. But it was the night masses that truly unsettled Thorne. He had not been invited to observe them, nor had anyone acknowledged their existence when he inquired directly. Yet each night, as the rain drummed against the bunker's metal roof, he heard the soft shuffle of boots moving through the mud, converging on some gathering place deeper in the trench system. The sounds carried with them a quality of devotion that made his skin crawl, a reverence too pure and too complete for mortal souls to sustain. On this particular evening, as Thorne cleaned the accumulated grime from a soldier's dog tags, he noticed something carved into the metal that had not been there during morning inspection. The etching was crude, but deliberate, a chalice with something thick and dark spilling over its rim, surrounded by what might have been stars or might have been wounds. The soldier, Private Callum, gazed at the tags with eyes that reflected no light whatsoever. "Where did this marking come from, my son?" Thorne asked, his voice carefully neutral. Callum's mouth opened and closed several times before words emerged, as if his tongue had forgotten its proper function. "The Grail remembers us, Father. We drink deep and become vessels ourselves." Before Thorne could respond, Callum had risen and walked away, his movements too fluid, too graceful for a man who had spent months crawling through mud and shellfire. The priest watched him disappear into the maze of trenches, noting how the other soldiers stepped aside without looking directly at him, as if acknowledging his presence might invite some terrible scrutiny. That night, Thorne lay on his narrow cot and listened to the sounds of gathering. The footsteps were more numerous than usual, and they moved with a precision that suggested ritual rather than mere congregation. He heard no voices, no hymns, no readings from scripture. Only the wet sound of movement and something else, something rhythmic and organic that might have been breathing or might have been chanting in a language that predated human speech. When he could bear the uncertainty no longer, Thorn rose and wrapped his military-issue cloak around his shoulders. The rain had intensified, each drop striking the bunker's roof like a small hammer blow. He pushed aside the canvas flap that served as a door and stepped into the trench. The mud immediately claimed his boots to the ankle, and he had to wrench each foot free with considerable effort. The walls of the trench pressed close on either side, their surfaces slick with moisture that gleamed too brightly in the sporadic light of corpse candles. These had been placed at irregular intervals, their flames burning with colors that hurt to look at directly. Blue-white fire that cast shadows which moved independently of their sources, revealing glimpses of carved symbols in the trench walls that vanished when observed directly. Thorn followed the sound of gathering, moving deeper into the network of passages than he had ever ventured before. The trenches here were older, their construction predating the current campaign. The blessed timber had been replaced with stones carved with faces that watched his passage with expressions of terminal anguish. Water dripped from overhead beams that might once have been consecrated wood but now resembled something more akin to fossilized bone. As he walked, he became aware that the rain above had ceased, though he could still hear water dripping from unseen sources. The silence was not peaceful but expectant, as if the entire trench system were holding its breath in anticipation of some momentous event. His own breathing sounded abnormally loud in his ears, and he found himself matching his steps to some rhythm that seemed to emerge from the very walls around him. The passage eventually opened into a wider chamber that Thorn did not recognize from any of the military maps he had studied. The space was roughly circular, its walls lined with alcoves that might once have held relics or icons, but now contained objects he could not immediately identify. The floor was packed earth, but earth of a quality he had never seen. Black as midnight and gleaming with an oily sheen that reflected the light of candles arranged in patterns that made his eyes water when he tried to follow their logic. At the center of the chamber stood what had once been an altar, though it bore no resemblance to any holy furniture Thorn had ever encountered. The stone was dark and porous, its surface covered with stains that could have been wine or could have been something far worse. Channels had been carved into its surface, creating a network of grooves that led to a central depression where something dark and viscous had pooled. Around this altar, perhaps 30 soldiers knelt in perfect silence. Their heads were bowed, but not in the manner of prayer Thorn recognized. Instead, they held their necks at angles that suggested their spines had been fundamentally altered, allowing them to bend in ways that should have been anatomically impossible. Their uniforms were clean despite weeks in the trenches, and their skin possessed a waxy quality that reflected the candlelight with unnatural uniformity. At the head of the altar stood a figure Thorn initially mistook for Father Mordecai. The man wore the robes of a military chaplain, but the fabric had been modified in ways that made the priest's eyes slide away whenever he tried to focus on the details. The sleeves were too long and moved independently of the wearer's arms, and the hood cast shadows that seemed to extend far beyond the confines of the garment itself. In the figure's hands was a chalice, not the simple cup used in standard communion services, but something ancient and terrible. The metal was black as the void between stars, and its surface was covered with engravings that seemed to shift and writhe when observed. The cup was large enough to hold perhaps a liter of liquid, and that liquid moved within the vessel with a consistency far too thick for wine. It clung to the sides of the chalice like partially congealed blood, but blood that possessed its own malevolent intelligence. The figure at the altar spoke in a voice that bypassed Thorn's ears entirely and resonated within his bones. The flesh is weak, but weakness can be sanctified. We gather not to transcend our mortal forms, but to perfect them through sacred rot. The Grail teaches us that suffering is not a punishment, but a sacrament, and that death is not an ending, but a transformation. The kneeling soldiers responded in unison, their voices creating harmonies that no human throat should have been able to produce. We drink deep and become vessels. We embrace the rot and find perfection in decay. The Grail remembers us, and we remember the Grail. The chaplain raised the chalice, and Thorn could see its contents more clearly. The liquid was indeed too thick to be wine, possessing a viscosity that suggested it was more akin to syrup or perhaps partially digested organic matter. As it moved within the cup, he caught glimpses of shapes that might have been solid particles suspended in the fluid, or might have been something far more disturbing. Tiny hands, miniature faces, fragments of recognizable anatomy swimming in the dark substrate. Tonight, we share the second blessing, the chaplain continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Those who have drunk from the first cup know the peace that comes with the absence of fear. Death holds no terror for us because we have already begun to die, and in dying we have found the true meaning of existence. But there is more to learn, more to become. The first soldier in the circle rose to his feet with movements that suggested his joints had been fundamentally reconfigured. As he approached the altar, Thorn could see that the man's face had undergone changes since their last interaction. The skin was paler and had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath. The eyes were larger than they should have been, and they reflected light in a manner that suggested the presence of additional structures behind the retina. The soldier accepted the chalice with hands that bore too many fingers, each digit long and pale and ending in nails that had grown into delicate claws. He raised the cup to his lips and drank deeply, his throat working in a manner that produced wet, organic sounds far too loud for the simple act of swallowing. When he lowered the chalice, his mouth was stained with the dark liquid, but the stain seemed to move and pulse as if it possessed its own circulatory system. As the cup was passed to the next soldier, Thorn noticed that its contents did not diminish. If anything, the level of liquid seemed to rise with each communion, as if the act of drinking somehow contributed to the vessel's capacity rather than depleting it. The second soldier drank with the same deliberate reverence, and when he finished, Thorn could see that changes were already beginning to manifest in his physical form. The man's torso had begun to elongate, stretching in ways that should have torn muscle and snapped bone, but instead seemed to be accommodating some internal restructuring. His ribs became visible through the skin as individual segments, but there were too many of them, and they moved with a rhythm that did not match his breathing. As Thorn watched in fascination and horror, the soldier's chest began to open along the sternum, revealing not organs but a cavity filled with the same dark liquid that had been in the chalice. The third soldier approached the altar, and Thorn realized with dawning horror that he recognized the man. Sergeant Malik had been one of his most devoted congregants during regular services, a career soldier who had maintained his faith through years of battlefield horror. Now, As he accepted the Grail, Thorn could see that Malik's transformation was already well advanced. The sergeant's arms had been restructured into something resembling altar fixtures. His forearms had flattened and developed shallow depressions along their length, creating crude but functional receptacles for candles or offerings. His hands had fused at the palms, creating a single, bowl-like appendage that he used to support the chalice as he drank. When he finished and turned to face the congregation, Thorn could see that his back had sprouted what could only be described as architectural elements. Small buttresses and Gothic arches that emerged from his shoulder blades and created a framework of living stone and bone. The communion continued, each soldier undergoing further modification as they partook of the Grail. Some developed additional limbs that resembled candlesticks or incense burners. Others found their torsos hollowing out to create spaces suitable for holding religious artifacts or portions of the sacred liquid. A few underwent changes that were more subtle, but perhaps more disturbing. Their skin took on the texture and appearance of carved marble. Their eyes became stained glass windows through which colored light somehow shone from within. Their voices acquired the resonant quality of cathedral bells. Through it all, the chaplain maintained his position at the altar, his robes moving with increasing animation as the ceremony progressed. Thorn began to suspect that the garments were not merely clothing but had become integrated with their wearer's physiology in some fundamental way. The sleeves pulsed with what might have been a heartbeat, and the hem of the robe had begun to merge with the stone floor of the chamber, creating root-like extensions that burrowed into the earth beneath. When the last soldier had drunk from the Grail, the chaplain raised the vessel above his head and spoke in a voice that now seemed to emerge from multiple sources throughout the chamber. "We are no longer merely soldiers of faith, but living embodiments of divine architecture. Our bodies have become altars, our bones have become buttresses, our blood has become the sacred wine that sustains all true believers. But this is only the beginning." The chaplain began to drink from the Grail, and as he did so, the most dramatic transformation yet began to unfold. His human form dissolved like wax in flame, but rather than melting into shapelessness, his constituent materials flowed upward and outward, taking on new configurations that defied both anatomy and physics. His bones became the framework for a massive altar that stretched from floor to ceiling. His organs transformed into architectural features of stunning complexity and terrible beauty. What had been his heart became a tabernacle whose doors opened and closed in rhythm with some cosmic pulse. His lungs became bellows that breathed incense and sacred smoke into the chamber. His brain, somehow still visible within a crystalline case at the altar's peak, continued to think and observe and direct the ongoing ceremony with an intelligence that had transcended merely human limitations. The transformed congregation arranged themselves around this living altar in poses that suggested both worship and structural support. Their modified bodies served as flying buttresses and decorative elements, creating a cathedral of flesh and bone that pulsed with unholy life. The chamber itself began to expand, its walls pushing outward to accommodate the growing structure. And Thorn realized that what he was witnessing was not merely a religious ceremony, but an act of architectural creation on a scale that would reshape the entire trench system. As if sensing his presence, the crystalline brain at the altar's peak turned its attention toward the shadows where Thorn had been hiding. The voice that emerged seemed to come from the very stones around him. "Father Thorn, we have been expecting you. The Grail has whispered of your arrival, and we have prepared a place for you in our congregation." Thorn felt his legs moving of their own accord, carrying him forward into the light of the transformed chamber. His rational mind screamed warnings and protests, but his body responded to a deeper compulsion that seemed to emerge from the very ground beneath his feet. The black earth of the chamber floor had begun to pulse with the same rhythm as the living altar, and with each pulse, Thorn felt his resistance weakening. "You have served the faith with dedication and sincerity," the voice continued. "But service and dedication are not enough. True faith requires transformation, requires the willingness to become something greater than merely human. The Grail offers this gift to all who are worthy to receive it." One of the transformed soldiers, a man whose body had become a mobile confessional booth complete with carved wooden panels and a lattice screen, approached Thorn with the chalice in hands that had become ornate silver implements. The dark liquid within seemed to call to him with a voice he could feel in his bones, promising relief from the burden of mortality and the gift of perfect, eternal service to the divine. Thorn's hands moved without conscious direction, accepting the Grail from the transformed soldier. The metal was warm to the touch, and he could feel a pulse within it that matched his own heartbeat. The liquid inside moved with eager anticipation, and he could see shapes forming and dissolving in its depths. Faces of saints he had venerated, symbols of faith he had spent his life studying. Visions of a cathedral that existed beyond the boundaries of physical space. As he raised the chalice toward his lips, Thorn felt the last of his resistance crumble. The promise of transformation was too compelling, the vision of perfect service too beautiful to reject. He opened his mouth and prepared to drink, knowing that with this act he would join the congregation of the living altar and become part of something far greater than his individual existence. But in the moment before the liquid touched his lips, a sound echoed through the chamber that brought him suddenly back to his senses. It was the tolling of a bell, but not any bell he had ever heard. This was the sound of sanctified bronze that had been blessed by saints and martyrs, a sound that cut through the supernatural influence of the Grail like a blade through silk. The sound was coming from above, from the original chapel where his orthodox altar still stood untransformed. Someone was ringing the emergency bell, the signal used to call all personnel to immediate assembly. The sound broke the spell that had been settling over Thorn's mind, and he suddenly understood with crystal clarity what he was about to do. With an effort that felt like tearing his own soul in half, Thorn hurled the chalice away from him. It struck the stone floor and shattered, releasing its contents in a spreading pool of dark liquid that hissed and steamed as it touched the blessed earth. The transformed congregation reacted with a collective shriek of anguish that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. The living altar pulsed with rage and pain, its crystalline brain flickering with lights that hurt to observe directly. The voice that emerged from its structure was no longer persuasive, but filled with a fury that promised eternal torment. You cannot reject the gift once it has been offered. The Grail remembers all who have seen its truth, and it will call to you until you answer. Thorn turned and ran, his feet slipping in the oily mud as he struggled to escape the chamber. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the transformed congregation reorganizing itself, their architectural bodies clicking and grinding as they prepared to pursue him. The living altar's voice followed him through the tunnels, promising that escape was temporary at best, that the influence of the Grail would seep into his dreams and his prayers until he had no choice but to return. The priests ran through passages that seemed to stretch and contract around him, as if the very geometry of the trench system had been infected by the power he had witnessed. Corpse candles flared to brilliant life as he passed, their flames reaching toward him like grasping fingers. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the living altar, and he could feel its influence trying to worm its way back into his consciousness. When he finally reached the original chapel, he found Major Corinth waiting for him with an expression of grim satisfaction. The officer was fully armed and accompanied by a squad of soldiers whose eyes held none of the terrible serenity Thorn had observed in the transformed congregation. "You've seen them, then," Corinth said without preamble. "The ones who found Mordecai's little experiment. We've been waiting for you to discover it on your own." Thorn struggled to catch his breath, his mind still reeling from what he had witnessed. You knew what was happening, and you allowed it to continue." Corinth nodded grimly. Mordecai was investigating reports of unusual religious activity among the troops. Strange confessions, unexplained changes in behavior, soldiers who stopped sleeping and stopped fearing death. He thought he could understand it, control it, maybe even use it. Instead, he became part of it. The Major gestured toward the deeper trenches where Thorn had just escaped. "What you saw down there is spreading. Each night the congregation grows larger, and each dawn we find more soldiers who have undergone the transformation. They're no longer entirely human, but they're also no longer entirely our soldiers. Their loyalty has shifted to something else entirely." Thorn felt his legs give way, and he collapsed onto one of the wooden pews that served as seating during regular services. The normalcy of the furniture felt surreal after what he had witnessed. What do they want? What is their purpose? From what we can determine, they're preparing for something they call the Great Communion, a ceremony that will spread their transformation beyond the boundaries of our trench system. They believe they can create a living cathedral that stretches across the entire battlefield, incorporating soldiers from all factions into their architectural congregation. The Major's expression grew even more grim, and based on what our intelligence suggests, they may be right. The Grail they use is not just a religious artifact, but something far older and more powerful. Our scholars believe it may be a fragment of the original chalice that was used during the opening of Hellgate Jerusalem, corrupted by centuries of exposure to infernal influence. Thorn looked up at the simple wooden cross that hung above his Orthodox altar, its familiar form now seeming fragile and inadequate in the face of what he had witnessed. Can it be stopped? Can the transformation be reversed? Corinth was quiet for a long moment before responding. "We don't know. What we do know is that the influence is growing stronger each night, and soon it will be impossible to contain. We need to act quickly before the next phase of their ceremony begins." The Major moved to the altar and produced a wooden box that Thorn had never seen before. Inside, nested in black velvet, was a collection of objects that radiated an aura of sanctified power, vials of holy water that had been blessed by saints, fragments of relics that had been present at the martyrdom of the faithful, and a single silver chalice whose surface was inscribed with prayers in languages that predated human civilization. "These are our weapons," Corinth explained. "Artifacts that have been consecrated specifically for use against supernatural corruption. They may be our only hope of stopping what Mordecai has unleashed." Thorn reached for one of the vials, feeling the blessed liquid within pulse with divine energy. It was warm to the touch and seemed to sing with voices that promised redemption rather than transformation. "What do you need me to do?" The congregation trusts you, or at least they did before tonight. If you return to them, if you pretend to accept their gift, you might be able to get close enough to their altar to use these weapons. It's dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it may be our only chance. The priest studied the artifacts in the box, understanding that accepting this mission would almost certainly mean his death. The transformed congregation would be expecting him to return, would be prepared for some form of resistance. But the alternative was to allow their influence to spread unchecked, to watch as the entire trench system was converted into a living cathedral of corrupted flesh and bone. "There's something else you should know," Corinth said quietly. "The reports we've been receiving suggest that this is not an isolated incident. Similar transformations have been reported in other sectors, other campaigns. Whatever power is behind the Grail, it's working on a scale far beyond our local situation." Thorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening rain. If the corruption was spreading across multiple battlefields, if other congregations were undergoing similar transformations, then what he had witnessed might be only a small part of something unimaginably vast and terrible. "How long do I have?" he asked. "The next gathering is scheduled for tomorrow night, assuming their pattern continues. That gives us less than 24 hours to prepare." Corinth closed the box and handed it to Thorn. "Use this time wisely, Father. Pray, prepare yourself spiritually. Make peace with whatever higher power you serve. Because once you enter that chamber again, there may be no coming back." Thorn spent the remainder of the night in prayer and preparation, but his devotions were interrupted by sounds from the deeper trenches that suggested the transformed congregation had not disbanded after his escape. If anything, their activity seemed to have intensified. He could hear the grinding and clicking of architectural bodies being rearranged, the wet sounds of organic materials being shaped into new configurations, and underneath it all, a low humming that might have been singing, or might have been the sound of construction on an inhuman scale. As dawn approached, the sounds gradually faded, but they left behind an atmosphere of expectation that made the very air feel thick and oppressive. The rain had resumed, and each droplet that struck the chapel's roof seemed to carry with it whispers and languages that hurt to comprehend. The walls themselves appeared to be listening, their wooden surfaces occasionally creaking in patterns that suggested they were responding to the sounds from deeper in the trench system. Thorn tried to conduct regular morning services, but the handful of soldiers who attended seemed distracted and uneasy. Several exhibited subtle changes that suggested they had been exposed to the Grail's influence. Their eyes reflected light in unusual ways. Their voices carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in multiple octaves simultaneously, and their prayers took on a cadence that matched the rhythm he had observed in the living altar. After the service, as Thorn was cleaning the altar, he discovered that someone had left an offering during the night. It was a small clay cup filled with a dark liquid that bore an unsettling resemblance to the contents of the Grail. The cup was crude but functional, and it had been placed precisely in the center of the altar where the communion chalice would normally rest during services. When he attempted to remove the cup, Thorn found that it had somehow fused with the wooden surface of the altar. The clay had merged with the blessed timber in a way that suggested organic growth rather than mere adhesion. As he watched, the dark liquid within began to move, forming patterns and shapes that reminded him of the architectural modifications he had witnessed in the transformed congregation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The influence of the Grail was not contained to the deeper chambers. It was already beginning to spread into the orthodox areas of the chapel, corrupting the very altar where he conducted regular services. The wooden surface around the cup had begun to develop the same oily sheen he had observed in the chamber floor, and he could see veins of dark material spreading outward from the point of contact. Desperate to prevent further contamination, Thorn reached for one of the vials of holy water from Corinth's collection. As the blessed liquid touched the cup, it began to steam and hiss, but rather than dissolving the corruption, it seemed to accelerate the transformation. The clay cup sprouted additional chambers and channels, creating a miniature version of the Grail that pulsed with the same malevolent intelligence as its larger counterpart. The altar itself began to change, its wooden surface rippling and flowing as if it were made of liquid rather than solid timber. The simple cross that had hung above it started to bend and twist, its straight lines curving into geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly. Within minutes, Thorn's orthodox altar had been transformed into something that belonged in the chamber of the living cathedral, a smaller but no less corrupt version of the architectural horror he had witnessed. As he backed away from the transformed altar, Thorn heard footsteps approaching through the trench passages, but these were not the normal sounds of soldiers moving through mud and timber. These footsteps had a precision and rhythm that suggested they belonged to beings whose anatomy had been fundamentally restructured. The transformed congregation was coming for him, and they were no longer content to wait for his voluntary return. The first figure to enter the chapel was the soldier who had served as a mobile confessional booth. His wooden panels had become more elaborate overnight, carved with scenes that depicted the transformation process in loving detail. The lattice screen through which penitents would normally speak had become a mouth filled with rows of teeth that had been carved from blessed bone. When he spoke, his voice emerged from multiple openings in his transformed body, creating harmonies that made the chapel's walls vibrate in sympathy. "Father Thorn, we have come to bring you home. The altar calls to its servant, and the Grail remembers your touch. There is no escape from the blessing once it has been offered." Behind the confessional soldier came others from the congregation, their architectural bodies clicking and grinding as they arranged themselves throughout the chapel. Some had become candlesticks that burned with flames of impossible colors. Others had transformed into pews and kneelers that suggested seating for congregants whose anatomy was no longer recognizably human. The soldier whose chest had opened to reveal a cavity filled with dark liquid now served as a font, his transformed body dispensing the corrupted sacrament to any who approached. Sergeant Malik, his arms now fully converted into altar fixtures, moved to stand beside Thorn's corrupted altar. The shallow depressions along his forearms had filled with the same dark liquid that had been in the Grail, and candles had sprouted from his shoulders like organic growths. When he turned to face Thorn, his marble-like skin reflected the candlelight in patterns that suggested carved reliefs depicting scenes of transformation and architectural ecstasy. "You have seen the truth of our purpose," Malik said, his voice now possessing the resonant quality of cathedral bells. "You understand that the flesh is weak, but can be sanctified through proper modification. Why do you resist the gift that has been offered to you?" Thorn clutched the box of consecrated artifacts, feeling their power pulse against his chest like a second heartbeat. The blessed objects seemed to create a small sphere of protection around him, preventing the transformed congregation from approaching too closely. But he could feel their influence pressing against the barrier, probing for weaknesses, seeking ways to overcome the sanctified defenses. Because what you offer is not sanctification but corruption, Thorn replied, his voice steadier than he had expected. You have not transcended humanity but abandoned it. You serve not the divine but something that wears the mask of divinity to hide its true nature. The congregation responded with a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been the grinding of stone against metal. The confessional soldiers' wooden panels opened wider, revealing an interior that was lined with what appeared to be organic writing, sentences carved into living flesh that pulsed and bled as they formed words. You speak of corruption as if it were a failing rather than a blessing. We have embraced the rot and found perfection in decay. We have accepted transformation and discovered architecture in anatomy. The Grail teaches us that suffering is not punishment, but sacrament, that death is not ending, but beginning. As the soldier spoke, Thorn could see that the corruption was continuing to spread throughout the chapel. The walls were developing the same oily sheen he had observed in the deeper chamber, and architectural elements were beginning to sprout from surfaces that had been plain wood and stone. Gothic arches emerged from the ceiling, flying buttresses grew from the walls, and the floor began to develop the channels and depressions that would allow it to serve as part of the living cathedral's circulation system. The transformed congregation arranged themselves in poses that provided structural support for the emerging architecture, their modified bodies serving as columns and decorative elements. The chapel was being converted into another chamber of the living cathedral, and Thorn realized that his presence was not required for the transformation to continue. The Grail's influence had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the blessed materials of the orthodox structure like a spiritual infection that converted rather than destroyed. The second communion approaches, Malik announced, his altar, arms beginning to glow with internal light. All who serve the true faith will be gathered into the cathedral's embrace. The boundaries between soldier and structure, between flesh and stone, between individual and congregation, will dissolve. We will become one entity, one purpose, one perfect expression of divine architecture. Thorn understood that he was witnessing the final phase of whatever plan the Grail had been working toward. The transformation of individual soldiers had been merely the beginning, a way of creating the necessary architectural elements for a much larger construction. The living cathedral was not meant to remain confined to the trench system, but to expand across the entire battlefield, incorporating soldiers from all factions into its structural matrix. As this realization struck him, Thorn felt the artifacts in the box pulse with increased urgency. The blessed objects were responding to the growing corruption, their sanctified power building toward some kind of critical threshold. He understood that if he was going to act, it would have to be now, before the transformation of the chapel was complete and his avenue of escape was permanently closed. With a prayer to whatever divine forces might still be listening, Thorn opened the box and seized the silver chalice. The moment his fingers touched the consecrated metal, the transformed congregation reacted with expressions of pain and rage. The blessed cup was clearly antithetical to their nature, its purified essence causing them physical distress merely through proximity. The confessional soldiers' wooden panels began to smoke and char where they faced the chalice. Malik's marble skin developed cracks that revealed not flesh and blood beneath but empty spaces filled with spiritual light. The other members of the congregation arranged themselves defensively around the corrupted altar, their architectural bodies creating barriers designed to prevent Thorn from approaching their central focus of power. But Thorn was not trying to reach the altar. Instead, He raised the blessed chalice above his head and began to recite prayers of consecration, words that called upon the highest powers of divine authority to cleanse the corruption and restore sanctified order. As he spoke, the silver cup began to glow with internal light, and that light spread outward in waves that caused the transformed congregation to retreat toward the edges of the chapel. The organic architecture that had been growing throughout the chamber began to wither and collapse, its unnatural structures unable to maintain cohesion in the presence of truly consecrated power. The corrupted altar cracked and split, releasing streams of the dark liquid that had been feeding its transformation. Where the liquid touched the blessed light emanating from the chalice, it hissed and steamed, eventually evaporating into vapors that carried with them the screams of whatever intelligence had inhabited the Grail. But the victory was temporary. Even as the immediate corruption was cleansed from the chapel, Thorn could hear sounds from the deeper trenches that suggested the living cathedral was far from defeated. The transformation he had witnessed was only one small part of a much larger structure, and the destruction of a single chamber would not significantly impact the overall entity. The confessional soldier, his wooden body now burning with silver fire, spoke in a voice filled with rage and promise. "You have delayed the inevitable, nothing more. The cathedral grows in chambers you have never seen, in trenches that stretch beyond the boundaries of human conflict. The second communion cannot be stopped by the destruction of a single altar or the purification of a single cup." As if summoned by these words, new sounds echoed through the trench system. Thorn could hear the movement of many feet, but these were not the architectural clicking and grinding of the transformed congregation. These were the sounds of normal soldiers, men who had not yet undergone the Grail's transformation but who moved with the same purposeful rhythm that suggested they were under some form of supernatural compulsion. Major Corinth appeared in the chapel doorway, but Thorn immediately recognized that something fundamental had changed about the officer. His uniform was immaculate despite weeks in the trenches. His skin possessed the same waxy quality that Thorn had observed in the early stages of transformation, and his eyes reflected light in a manner that suggested structural modifications had already begun behind the retina. "Father Thorn," Corinth said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in multiple octaves, "I'm afraid your services are no longer required in their current capacity. The Grail has shown us a more perfect form of devotion." Behind Corinth came a procession of soldiers that Thorn recognized from regular services, but each had begun to exhibit the early signs of transformation. Their uniforms hung differently on bodies that were subtly restructuring themselves. Their movements carried the fluid grace of beings whose joints had been fundamentally reconfigured, and their faces bore expressions of serene certainty that made Thorn's skin crawl. Private Kellum was among them, the dog tags around his neck now bearing additional symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed directly. The crude chalice carving had spread across the metal surface, creating intricate patterns that hurt to follow with the eye. When he smiled at Thorn, his teeth had taken on the appearance of small architectural elements, tiny buttresses and arches that suggested his mouth was being converted into a miniature cathedral space. "We tried to bring you into the congregation gently," Corinth continued, his skin beginning to show the translucent pallor that preceded more dramatic modifications. "But gentle methods require time we no longer possess. The Hebrew Knights have begun their final assault on our positions, and the Iron Sultanate's relic, engines, are approaching from the eastern approaches." The second communion must proceed immediately if we are to complete the cathedral before our enemies can interfere. Thorn clutched the blessed chalice more tightly, feeling its purified power pulse against his palms. But he could sense that the artifact's influence was limited, that it could cleanse local corruption but could not stand against the vast network of transformation that had already taken root throughout the trench system. The living cathedral was too large, too well established, too deeply integrated into the very foundations of their defensive positions. You cannot force transformation, Thorn said, backing toward the rear of the chapel where a secondary exit led to the surface trenches. Faith that is compelled is not faith at all, but slavery disguised as devotion. Corinth's laugh carried the sound of grinding stone. Force? Father, you misunderstand our purpose entirely. We offer no compulsion, only invitation. The Grail calls to those who are ready to answer, and transformation comes to those who truly desire it. What you mistake for force is simply the recognition that your resistance has always been an illusion. As if responding to some unspoken signal, the soldiers behind Corinth began to arrange themselves in formation throughout the chapel. But this was not a military formation designed for combat or crowd control. Instead, they positioned themselves in patterns that complemented the architectural elements still growing from the chapel's structure, their bodies serving as living supports for arches and buttresses that were sprouting from surfaces that had been blessed timber only hours before. The corruption had not been truly cleansed by Thorn's use of the sacred chalice, merely temporarily suppressed. Now it was returning with renewed vigor, fed by the presence of so many partially transformed congregants. The walls began to pulse with the same organic rhythm Thorn had observed in the deeper chamber, and he could see channels beginning to form in the wooden planks, creating pathways for the dark liquid that would serve as the cathedral's circulatory system. The second communion is not a ceremony, but a birth, one of the soldiers explained, his voice emerging from a throat that had begun to develop additional chambers for enhanced resonance. We have spent weeks becoming the individual components of the cathedral's structure. Tonight, those components will be joined into a single living entity that stretches from our trenches to the enemy positions and beyond. Thorn realized with growing horror that the scope of the transformation was far larger than he had imagined. The living cathedral was not meant to be confined to their own trench system, but to grow across the entire battlefield, incorporating soldiers from all factions into its architectural matrix. The war itself was being converted into a single, vast religious structure dedicated to the worship of sanctified suffering. The Hebrew Knight's relic, engines, will become the cathedral's bell towers. Corinth continued, his skin now showing the first signs of the marble-like texture that characterized advanced transformation. The Iron Sultanate's blessed fortifications will serve as our flying buttresses. The Trench Pilgrims' sepulchres will house our most sacred relics. All factions, all soldiers, all instruments of war will be unified in perfect architectural harmony. The blessed chalice in Thorn's hands began to grow warm, its sanctified power responding to the increasing corruption around him. But rather than providing protection, the artifact seemed to be calling attention to his presence, marking him as the single uncontaminated element in a space that was rapidly being converted to serve the cathedral's purposes. As he watched, the soldiers' transformations accelerated, their bodies flowing like soft wax as they took on the architectural forms their roles in the cathedral required. Some became pillars with their arms stretched overhead to support stone arches that grew from their shoulders. Others hollowed out their torsos to create spaces for candles and offerings, their internal organs rearranging themselves to accommodate the new configurations. Private Kellum approached Thorn with movements that suggested his skeleton had been completely restructured to serve architectural rather than biological functions. His arms had become decorative supports, his legs had fused into a single column, and his head had tilted backward, at an angle that allowed his face to serve as a carved relief, depicting scenes of transformation and architectural ecstasy. "The Grail remembers you, Father," Kellum said, his voice now emerging from openings that had appeared throughout his transformed body. "It has been waiting for you to join the congregation since the moment you first entered these trenches. Your resistance has only made the eventual transformation more complete, more perfect." Thorn felt the walls of the chapel pressing closer around him, their surfaces now flowing like liquid stone as they adapted to serve the cathedral's structural requirements. The secondary exit he had been moving toward had sealed itself, the wooden planks flowing together to create a surface that bore carved reliefs depicting the stages of architectural transformation. The blessed chalice pulsed with increasing urgency in his hands, its sacred power building toward some kind of critical threshold. Thorn understood that the artifact was not merely a tool for cleansing corruption, but a focus for divine intervention, a way of calling upon powers that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical battlefield. With a prayer that felt like tearing his own soul from his body, Thorn raised the chalice above his head and shattered it against the chapel's stone floor. The consecrated silver exploded into fragments that burned with white-hot fire, each piece carrying with it a portion of the divine power that had been contained within the cup. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The transformed soldiers screamed in voices that carried harmonics, spanning multiple octaves, their architectural bodies beginning to crack and crumble as the blessed fire spread throughout the chamber. The organic architecture that had been growing from the chapel's surfaces withered and collapsed, releasing streams of the dark liquid that hissed and steamed as it came into contact with the sanctified flames. But even as the immediate corruption was destroyed, Thorn could hear sounds from throughout the trench system that suggested the larger cathedral was responding to the attack. The living structure was vast and complex, with chambers and passages that extended far beyond the boundaries of their military position. The destruction of a single chapel, no matter how dramatically accomplished, would not significantly impact the overall entity. Major Corinth, his body now wreathed in silver fire that caused his transforming flesh to smoke and crack, spoke in a voice filled with pain but also with certainty. "You have won a single battle in a war that spans dimensions, Father. The Grail's influence extends far beyond this battlefield, far beyond this war, far beyond the boundaries of mortal conflict. What you have witnessed here is only the smallest fraction of its true scope." As the blessed fire spread throughout the chapel, consuming the transformed congregation and cleansing the corrupted architecture, Thorn caught glimpses of visions that seemed to emerge from the flames themselves. He saw other battlefields where similar transformations were taking place, other chaplains discovering congregations that had embraced architectural modification, other Grails spreading their influence through military units across the known world. The scope of the conspiracy was unimaginably vast, reaching into every faction and every theater of the war. The living cathedral he had witnessed was not a unique occurrence, but part of a network of structures that spanned continents, all working towards some ultimate purpose that his human mind could not fully comprehend. In the final moments before the blessed fire consumed everything in the chapel, Thorn saw a vision that made his soul recoil in terror. He saw the completed cathedral, as it would exist when all the individual structures had been joined into a single entity. It stretched across the entire world, its spires reaching into the heavens while its foundations burrowed deep into the earth's core. Every soldier who had ever fought in the war had been incorporated into its architectural matrix, their transformed bodies serving as the building blocks for a structure dedicated to the worship of sanctified suffering. And at the cathedral's heart, in a chamber that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, stood the original Grail from which all others had been spawned. It was not a cup, but a living thing, a parasite of unimaginable intelligence that fed on faith and devotion while providing the illusion of spiritual transcendence. The entity had been working for decades to create the conditions necessary for its ultimate manifestation, using the war as a means of gathering the raw materials it needed for its architectural incarnation. The vision faded as the blessed fire reached its peak intensity, consuming the last traces of corruption from the chapel and leaving behind only sanctified ash and the lingering scent of purified incense. Thorn found himself alone in a space that had been restored to its original configuration, with simple wooden walls and a plain altar that bore no trace of the transformations it had undergone. But the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of temporary reprieve, the quiet that comes between movements of a symphony that has not yet reached its conclusion. Thorn could feel the presence of the larger cathedral pressing against the boundaries of the cleansed space, probing for weaknesses, seeking ways to re-establish its corrupting influence. He walked to where the chapel's single window looked out over the trench system, and what he saw there confirmed his worst fears. The transformation had not been stopped, but merely delayed. Throughout the network of passages and bunkers, he could see the glow of architectural modification taking place on a massive scale. Entire sections of the trench system were being restructured, their military functions abandoned in favor of cathedral architecture. The sound of construction echoed through the night air, but it was construction of a kind that no human engineer had ever conceived. The sounds were organic and architectural simultaneously, the grinding of stone mixed with the wet slithering of transformed flesh. The hammering of construction blended with the beating of thousands of hearts that had been reconfigured to serve as the cathedral's circulation system. In the distance, Thorn could see the lights of enemy positions beginning to flicker and change, their normal electric illumination giving way to the impossible colors of corpse candles and architectural fires. The transformation was spreading beyond the boundaries of their own military unit, reaching across no man's land to embrace soldiers who had been fighting on opposing sides only hours before. The war was ending, not through victory or defeat, but through transformation into something that transcended human conflict entirely. Every soldier, every chaplain, every officer was being absorbed into the living cathedral's structure. Their individual identities dissolved into the collective consciousness of an entity that existed to worship sanctified suffering. Thorn understood that his resistance had been anticipated and accounted for from the beginning. The Grail had allowed him to witness its true nature, had permitted him to cleanse a single chapel, had even encouraged his efforts to combat its influence. Because resistance, like everything else, could be transformed into a component of the cathedral's architecture. His defiance would become a decorative element, His faith would serve as mortar between the stones. His very soul would be integrated into the structure's foundation. The blessed chalice he had shattered had not destroyed the corruption, but had instead provided it with the final component it needed to complete its transformation of the battlefield. As dawn approached, Thorn could see the cathedral's spires beginning to emerge from the trench system, their Gothic arches reaching toward a sky that had taken on colors that had no names in human language. The structure was beautiful beyond description and terrible beyond comprehension, a perfect fusion of architectural magnificence and spiritual corruption. The priest knelt before his simple altar and began to pray, not for salvation or deliverance, but for the strength to maintain his individual consciousness for as long as possible. He could feel the cathedral's influence seeping back into the chapel despite the blessed fire's purification, drawn by his own presence like a spiritual infection that could not be permanently cleansed. His prayers took on a rhythm that matched the construction sounds from outside, and he realized with dawning horror that even his resistance was being incorporated into the cathedral's design. His voice was becoming part of the architectural symphony. His faith was serving as a foundation stone. His very existence was being transformed into a component of the structure he had tried so desperately to oppose. As the sun rose over a battlefield that was no longer recognizable as a theater of human conflict, Thorn felt his individual identity beginning to dissolve into something larger and more terrible than anything he had ever imagined. The last coherent thought that passed through his mind before the transformation claimed him completely was a prayer that somewhere, in some other trench system or battlefield, another chaplain might witness what he had witnessed and possess the wisdom to understand that some forms of faith are too perfect to be truly divine. The chapel fell silent except for the sound of stone growing into new configurations and the wet whisper of flesh adapting to serve architectural purposes. Outside, the living cathedral continued its expansion across a world that had forgotten the difference between devotion and damnation, between faith and transformation, between the worship of the divine and the sanctification of suffering itself.